around this building, and everyone is so supportive and so excited about what is happening with the fever.
It's the rumor that's rattling the WNBA to its very foundation. A whisper that exploded into a roar across every corner of social media, tearing through fan forums and group chats like a raging digital wildfire. Did Indiana Fever general manager Lynn Dunn finally break her silence? Did she just confirm that Stephanie White, a deeply respected coaching figure, a woman once considered a cornerstone of this franchise, actually walked away from the Indiana organization because of explosive behind-the-scenes tension with their transcendent new superstar? Caitlin Clark. The very idea is so incendiary it almost defies belief. A narrative pulled straight from the pages of a Hollywood sports thriller. A coach turning her back on a generational phenomenon. The single most hyped prospect the sport of basketball has ever seen. It implies a level of dysfunction so severe, so deeply embedded, that it threatens to rip the entire organization apart from the inside out. A foundational decay that no individual player, no matter how talented, could possibly repair. Fans are demanding accountability, flooding comment sections and live call-in shows with their theories, their frustrations, and their outrage. And the silence pouring out of the front office has been absolutely deafening, a total vacuum of information that only pours gasoline on an already raging fire of speculation. But as the layers begin to peel back, as the whispers get traced all the way to their origin point, the story becomes something far more complicated and far more shocking than a simple resignation. The truth isn't just about one coach walking out the door. It's about an entire franchise teetering on the absolute razor's edge of a catastrophic, full-scale meltdown, with Caitlin Clark standing directly at the center of the inferno, the unwilling eye of a hurricane she never intended to create. The GM's words may have been distorted and manipulated, but the crisis they point toward is terrifyingly, undeniably real. Music, and what has been unfolding behind closed doors, inside the locker room walls and throughout the executive offices, is far worse, far more dysfunctional than anything anyone on the outside could have possibly imagined. The stakes have stopped being about a disappointing season. They are now about the long-term future of a superstar and the entire credibility of a storied franchise. The bombshell headline practically writes itself. A perfect storm of celebrity, conflict, and catastrophic failure. But the immediate truth is even more jarring, because it exposes a deeper and far more insidious deception buried at the very heart of this entire media frenzy. Stephanie White is not the current head coach of the Indiana Fever. In fact, she hasn't been for years. She is a ghost from a completely different era of this franchise's history. She paced those sidelines back in 2015 and 2016 before moving on entirely, long before Caitlin Clark was dominating college basketball and capturing the imagination of an entire nation. The woman actually tasked with steering this ship through the most unprecedented media storm in WNBA history is head coach Christy Sides. So why did this rumor, so completely and easily debunked, catch fire and burn so intensely across the entire sports world? Because it taps into a desperate, almost primal need for an explanation, any explanation at all, for the disaster currently unfolding in Indiana. The Fever, armed with the most electrifying and most hyped rookie in the history of professional sports, a player who single-handedly transformed the value and viewership of an entire league overnight, are failing. And they are failing in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. They aren't simply losing games. They are losing them in ways that look chaotic, undisciplined, and at times completely and utterly devoid of hope. The promised revolution has, so far, resembled a slow-motion catastrophe more than anything else. A textbook lesson in how to completely squander a once-in-a-generation opportunity. This fabricated rumor about Stephanie White is not merely an error or an innocent misunderstanding. It is a symptom, a glaring symptom, of a fan base and an entire media landscape desperately scrambling to make rational sense out of something that feels completely irrational. It is a collective scream for answers, a frantic search for a villain in a story where absolutely everyone appears to be losing at the same time. The lie traveled so rapidly because the actual truth of the situation is almost too painful for people to fully confront, that the problem is not a ghost from seasons past, but a very real, very public, very visible crisis unraveling under the current leadership in real time. The Stephanie White narrative was nothing more than a smokescreen, a conveniently dramatic piece of fiction designed to distract from the genuine, far more mundane and far more terrifying fire that is burning this entire franchise from the inside out. And that fire is burning most intensely directly beneath Christie's sides, whose seat is no longer merely hot but scorching, practically incandescent with pressure and expectation. Every music, single game, the broadcast cameras find her on the sideline, and the expression etched across her face tells the entire story without a single word needing to be spoken. It is a cinematic portrait of a person under siege. A combustible mixture of deep-seated frustration, visible helplessness, and wide-eyed panic that she seems completely powerless to conceal from the world. She was handed the ultimate golden ticket in Caitlin Clark, a player who single-handedly guarantees sold-out arenas on the road and record-shattering television ratings every single night. But that ticket arrived attached to an impossible, crushing demand. Immediate, flawless, undeniable success. Instead, she finds herself presiding over a team that leads the entire league in turnovers and defensive breakdowns. A team that frequently looks as though they introduce themselves to one another in the parking lot minutes before tip-off. Her public statements have increasingly begun to sound less like a coach projecting calm and instilling genuine confidence, and more like someone desperately pleading for a life raft while being swallowed whole by a hostile, unforgiving ocean. She speaks constantly about the necessity of toughness, about how her players must learn to anticipate and embrace the physical nature of the professional game. But her words ring hollow, like a broken record skipping over the same tired track. Music. When the on-court product being delivered night after night is this consistently chaotic and this painfully soft, the talk of strategic adjustments begins to feel like pure fantasy. Defensive schemes crumble the very moment an opponent sets a single screen. Lineups get shuffled without any discernible logic or coherent reasoning, broadcasting a message of pure desperation to everyone watching rather than any semblance of calculated strategy. The team's offense, which should function as a high-powered, precision machine built entirely around the gravitational force of Clark's brilliance, consistently devolves into something resembling unorganized playground basketball, with players appearing lost, emotionally disconnected, and visibly frustrated with one another. It has become painfully, undeniably obvious to every single person watching that Sides is not simply being outcoached by her opponents on the other bench. She is being fundamentally and completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the moment itself. The crushing pressure of managing the Caitlin Clark media circus simultaneously while developing an entire roster packed with other young lottery picks, and somehow winning games in the process, appears to have driven her directly to her absolute breaking point. She is no longer simply coaching a basketball team. She has become the unwilling captain of a vessel taking on water at an alarming rate, publicly rearranging the deck chairs while the hull beneath her fills faster than anyone can bail it out. And she appears to have absolutely no idea how to plug the holes before the entire ship goes under. And what happened next would strongly suggest that the person who hired her is not only rapidly running out of patience, but is actively preparing to throw her overboard entirely. This brings us directly to General Manager Lynn Dunn, the chief architect of this entire grand experiment, the woman who drafted Clark, who hired Sides, and who now owns every consequence of both of those decisions. While she never once uttered Stephanie White's name in any public setting or forum, her recent statements have been interpreted by insiders and seasoned analysts alike as a damning and barely veiled indictment of the current state of the organization. In the carefully managed and tightly controlled world of professional sports, general managers almost never fire a coach mid-sentence during a press conference. Instead, they deploy coded language, a particular music brand of corporate speak specifically engineered to send a loud and unmistakable message without triggering an immediate, uncontrollable explosion. And Dunn has been chillingly, surgically precise. She has spoken openly about accountability, a word that in professional sports is almost universally aimed like a laser directly at the coaching staff and their inability to produce results on the floor. She has referenced the steep learning curve facing this team, which the vast majority of people in and around the league have read as a pointed and deliberate criticism of the team's persistent lack of preparation and discipline under Sides. When a general manager stops talking about winning basketball games and pivots to discussing processes and accountability while her franchise is locked in a catastrophic nosedive, it is an unmistakable public signal that her patience has been stretched beyond its absolute limit. This is the real confirmation that the rumors were built upon and circling around. Dunn is not confirming any story involving a former coach from years gone by. She is confirming, in her own carefully cryptic and coldly calculated way, that the current state of her franchise is completely, totally, and utterly unacceptable. She is placing Christie Sides on formal notice in front of the entire sports world, communicating directly to the media and to the fan base that the status quo will not, under any circumstances, be tolerated going forward. Every meticulously chosen word she delivers publicly functions as a warning shot fired directly across the bow. A crystal-clear message to everyone paying attention that if things do not turn around, and turn around with urgency, she will not hesitate for a single moment to make a drastic, landscape-altering, franchise-shaking change. The pressure cascading down from the very top of the organization is becoming utterly unbearable, manufacturing a deeply toxic environment saturated with fear and uncertainty that is seeping poison into every single corner of the organization, from the locker room floor all the way to the training facility. To make the entire situation even worse, to add a layer of almost cosmic cruelty to an already brutal narrative, while the Fever are publicly and visibly imploding, the ghost at the center of their false rumor is absolutely thriving elsewhere. Stephanie White, the very coach at the heart of the fabricated story, is now the head coach of the Connecticut Sun, and she has them operating like a flawlessly tuned machine, a legitimate and credible championship contender. The contrast between the two organizations is not merely stark. It is almost sadistic in its clarity. The Sun are disciplined, physically imposing, deeply cohesive, and they execute their game plan with a level of military precision that is genuinely beautiful to watch. They are in every conceivable and measurable way the absolute and total antithesis of everything the Indiana Fever currently represent. Every single time the Sun secure another victory with their sharp, efficient, and purposeful brand of basketball, with an identity forged on suffocating defense and selfless teamwork, it serves as a painful and agonizing public reminder to Fever fans everywhere of what genuinely competent coaching and a clearly defined organizational vision actually look like in practice. It manufactures a brutal and haunting what-if scenario that refuses to stop following this franchise. What if a coach carrying White's depth of experience, her unshakable calm demeanor, and her steady, sure-handed approach were the one guiding Caitlin Clark through the treacherous and unforgiving waters of her rookie season? Would this team look this chaotic and disorganized on a nightly basis? Would the losses be accumulating this rapidly and this embarrassingly on a national stage? The honest answer, for most people paying close attention, seems highly unlikely. Stephanie White's resounding success with Connecticut has become an entirely unintentional but devastatingly effective weapon being wielded against both Christy Sides and Lynn Dunn simultaneously. She stands as a living, breathing, winning embodiment of a standard of excellence that the Indiana Fever franchise is currently nowhere in the vicinity of approaching. This has never been about her walking away from any drama. It has always been about her representing a level of competence and organizational clarity that makes the Fever's ongoing struggles look even more pathetic and completely inexcusable by direct comparison. Her continued winning is salt poured generously and repeatedly into a very deep and very fresh wound, proving loudly to the entire sports world that leadership is not a minor detail but rather the absolute everything. Music. And the Fever's leadership, at this most crucial and defining crossroads in their modern franchise history, is catastrophically, visibly, and undeniably failing at every single level. That catastrophic failure of leadership appears to be shredding the locker room apart completely at the seams. The narrative of a profoundly divided team has long since stopped being a quiet whisper circulated among industry insiders. It has become a visible, tangible, undeniable reality playing out, music, on the court for millions of people to witness with their own eyes every single game. The incident involving Chicago Sky's Kennedy Carter, where she delivered what can only be described as a cheap shot, a cold and deliberate blindside hip check aimed directly at Caitlin Clark, was merely the very tip of a massive and dangerous iceberg lurking beneath the surface. The far more revealing and troubling element, the part that sent genuine alarm bells ringing throughout the entire league, was the reaction that followed, or far more accurately, the stunning and damning complete absence of any meaningful reaction whatsoever from Clark's own teammates. Not a single player immediately came to her defense. Not one person stepped up to confront Carter or make it known that touching their star player carried consequences. The chemistry that was supposed to be organically developing and solidifying around their generational new superstar looks fundamentally shattered, fractured at its very core, and possibly damaged in ways that go beyond anything a simple conversation or a team meeting could ever fully repair. Watch the broadcast footage carefully during the games. After a missed shot or a costly momentum-killing turnover, Clark's frustration bleeds through the screen, her body language deflating visibly, her shoulders sinking under the weight of it all, but the support and solidarity from her surrounding teammates too often feels performative at its absolute best, or entirely, conspicuously non-existent at its devastating worst. Players like Aaliyah Boston, last season's Rookie of the Year and the supposed co-star of this franchise's carefully constructed vision of the future, consistently looks disconnected and out of sync with Clark on the floor, presenting herself at times as an almost unwilling participant in the heliocentric offensive system built around their new superstar. The fluid, dynamic, and electrifying two-woman game that fans across the country and analysts around the league spent an entire offseason dreaming about has been unceremoniously replaced by awkward possessions, ill-timed forced passes, and missed opportunities that scream loudly and unmistakably of a profound lack of communication, trust, and shared purpose. Is it jealousy simmering beneath the surface over the absolutely unprecedented level of attention and adoration that Clark attracts everywhere she goes? Is it deep-seated frustration with Clark's characteristically high-risk, high-reward style of play that can be as maddening as it is breathtaking? Or is it the most damning possibility of all, a clear and undeniable sign that Christy Sides has lost complete and total control of her locker room, rendered fundamentally unable to unify a room full of young, fiercely competitive athletes beneath a singular, coherent, and motivating collective vision? Whatever the root cause ultimately turns out to be, the result is identical and inescapable. A team that does not remotely resemble a team in any meaningful sense. They play like five separate individuals desperately trying to survive on a deserted island with no shared map and no shared plan. And that deep internal fracture is making them predictable, exploitable, and dangerously easy prey for every other team in the league. In the very middle of it all, positioned at the absolute center of this swirling and suffocating vortex of chaos, is Caitlin Clark herself. And the part of this crisis that nobody wants to say out loud, the uncomfortable truth lurking beneath every conversation, is the impossible problem she creates simply by being exactly who she is. This is not about her attitude or any critique of her immense and undeniable talent. This is entirely about the sheer, suffocating, inhuman weight of her superstardom pressing down on everything and everyone around her. She arrived in the WNBA not merely as a highly anticipated rookie, but as a full-blown cultural phenomenon, a singular figure handed the impossible task of saving and completely revolutionizing an entire professional league overnight. That caliber of pressure is genuinely inhuman, an unbearable and impossible burden for any 22-year-old on the face of the earth to carry, and the cracks under that weight are beginning to spread and deepen with every passing game. Her turnover numbers are historically alarming for a rookie, a direct byproduct of a player trying desperately to do far too much on a team that provides her precious little meaningful support. Her visible and increasingly raw frustration with officiating and the relentlessly brutal physicality directed at her has produced technical fouls and on-court outbursts that get dissected, debated, and replayed endlessly on every sports talk show and highlight reel across the country. She is being specifically targeted and physically punished by opponents every single night without exception. Treated not with the patience typically extended to a first-year player, but instead like a 10-year veteran who must be physically and psychologically dominated into submission. The Caitlin Clark effect has delivered charter flights, perpetually sold-out arenas in every city on the schedule, and multi-million-dollar media and sponsorship deals that have transformed the league's financial landscape. But it has simultaneously created an environment of such ferocious and unrelenting scrutiny that it functions like a magnifying glass held over every single flaw, every music mistake, every miscommunication, and every loss, burning them into the public consciousness in real time. Christy Sides is not simply coaching a basketball player anymore. She is attempting to manage and protect a global brand with all of its enormous commercial weight and cultural significance. The other players on this roster are no longer simply teammates in the traditional sense. They are supporting characters cast involuntarily into the Caitlin Clark show, a role that some among them clearly and visibly resent with an intensity that bleeds through the television screen. This environment, this unprecedented and uniquely suffocating set of circumstances, may simply be fundamentally unmanageable for any coach alive, let alone one who already demonstrates clear and repeated signs of being completely in over her head. Clark's extraordinary talent and her towering global fame, the very twin forces that were supposed to represent the Indiana Fever's long-awaited salvation and rocket fuel for a dynasty, might actually be serving as the accelerant pouring onto the very fire that is burning this franchise entirely to the ground. Music. So where exactly does all of this leave the Indiana Fever? They are completely and inescapably trapped inside a perfect storm, a devastating and seemingly inescapable confluence of catastrophic elements colliding all at once. They have a general manager who is broadcasting her profound and escalating displeasure loudly and publicly through carefully deployed coded threats that fool absolutely no one inside the league. They have a head coach who looks utterly and completely out of her depth, paralyzed and visibly lost in the blinding and unforgiving glare of the national spotlight. They have a locker room that appears fractured beyond easy repair, seething with unspoken resentment, and stripped entirely of the genuine chemistry and collective trust required to win basketball games at this level. And they have a superstar player who is struggling mightily and publicly under the crushing weight of impossible expectations while absorbing a level of physical punishment from opponents that borders on the unconscionable. The season is still relatively young by any measure, but the trajectory being carved out night after night is pointing with devastating clarity toward complete and total organizational disaster. A historic and embarrassing failure of execution that could realistically set this franchise back not by months, but by years. Lynn Dunn is now staring directly into the face of an ultimatum, one that is overwhelmingly and uncomfortably of her own careful construction. Does she fire Christy Sides mid-season in a move that would represent a shocking and humiliating public admission of catastrophic failure? But that might be the only remaining option to salvage any meaningful portion of what is left of the year? Does she pursue a major and disruptive roster trade, aggressively shaking up the team's deeply questionable chemistry by moving a significant piece, perhaps even last year's coveted #1 overall pick, Aaliyah Boston? Or does she allow it all to continue burning, clinging to the increasingly desperate and implausible hope that this team somehow discovers its footing through sheer luck and circumstance alone? A prospect that grows more remote and more unrealistic with each embarrassing, widely watched, nationally televised loss that piles onto the record. The Stephanie White rumor was ultimately nothing more than a deliberate distraction, a carefully packaged piece of fabricated news that accidentally pointed a floodlight directly at a very real and very serious underlying problem. The issue was never remotely about a coach who departed this organization nearly a decade ago. The issue is that the current leadership structure, from top to bottom, appears completely and utterly incapable of rising to meet the single greatest opportunity this franchise has ever been handed in its entire existence. A final shocking and seismic move feels not just possible at this point, but agonizingly, inevitably imminent. In the end, the viral rumor that ignited this firestorm was pure fantasy, a simple and easily digestible fiction manufactured to explain away a complex, uncomfortable, and deeply ugly reality. Stephanie White did not walk away from anything because of Caitlin Clark. But the actual truth waiting on the other side of that fiction is infinitely and devastatingly more damning for the Indiana Fever organization. The franchise, from the highest levels of its front office all the way down to the last player sitting at the end of the bench, was fundamentally and structurally unprepared in every meaningful way for the force of nature they celebrated drafting. They were handed a golden goose in Caitlin Clark, a player with the rare and extraordinary power to print money, fill buildings, move the cultural needle, and build a dynasty that could define the league for a generation. But rather than constructing the golden palace that such a gift demanded and deserved, they appear instead to be presiding over a chaotic, dysfunctional, and rudderless barnyard with no blueprint and no clear direction. This franchise now stands at a genuinely terrifying crossroads, a pivotal and defining moment that will cast a long shadow over everything that follows for the next decade or longer. Every loss that gets added to the ledger, every frustrated and anguished soundbite captured from their star player on a hot microphone, and every painful and awkward on-court interaction between teammates pushes the entire enterprise closer to a breaking point that, once reached, could shatter this young team in ways that leave permanent and irreversible damage. The question has evolved far beyond whether this group can compete for a championship in the current season. The question now is whether they can survive the remainder of this season without a full-scale, catastrophic implosion that leaves lasting scars on their most important and irreplaceable asset, their young superstar. Music. Will the Caitlin Clark era ultimately be looked back upon as the transformative and triumphant moment the Indiana Fever finally turned the corner and emerged as a genuine marquee franchise deserving of the national attention being lavished upon them? Or will it instead be remembered as a tragic and avoidable cautionary tale, the year that the brightest, most electric star the sport of basketball had produced in a generation was delivered to a franchise so deeply and hopelessly dysfunctional that it somehow managed to dim her extraordinary light before she ever truly had a fighting chance to let it shine the way the entire world was waiting to see? The whole world is watching with wide eyes and a collective held breath. Music, waiting for the answer.